The story of human genetics is supposed to be settled. We migrated out of Africa tens of thousands of years ago. We spread across continents, separating into distinct populations. We developed different characteristics in response to different environments. Our DNA records this journey, a branching tree of human diversity rooted in ancient African origins. This is what we're taught. This is what genetic testing companies tell us when they analyze our samples. This is the framework through which we understand human ancestry. But what if the framework is wrong? What if there's a chapter of human genetic history that's been deliberately excluded? What if the branching tree has roots we're not supposed to know about? I started investigating anomalies in genetic data that the standard model couldn't explain. Sequences that appeared where they shouldn't, markers shared by populations that had supposedly been separated for millennia, patterns that suggested connection where the official history insisted there was isolation. The deeper I went, the more the official story collapsed. The genetic evidence points towards something extraordinary, a relatively recent genetic contribution that affected human populations globally. DNA that appears in people of every recognized ancestry, a shared inheritance that connects all modern humans in ways the standard model refuses to acknowledge. Tartarian DNA, not a separate species, not an ancient ancestor, a civilization that existed recently enough that its genetic legacy remains detectable in modern populations. A contribution so widespread that it fundamentally reshaped human genetics within the last few centuries. The evidence is in the data, in the sequences that don't fit, in the markers that shouldn't be shared, in the patterns that reveal connection where we're told there was none. All humans are actually connected, not just through ancient African origins, but through something far more recent, something that's been erased from history but remains written in our very cells. Let me start with what genetic testing actually reveals, as opposed to what we're told it reveals. When you submit DNA for ancestry analysis, the testing company compares your genetic markers against reference populations. These references are supposed to represent distinct human groups with known geographic origins and documented histories. The algorithm matches your markers to these references, producing percentages: 40% British, 25% West African, 15% East Asian. The specificity creates an illusion of precision, of settled science, of clear categories. But the categories are constructs. The reference populations were selected based on assumptions about human history. The algorithms were trained to find patterns consistent with those assumptions. The results confirm the framework because the framework shaped how results are generated. When markers don't fit the reference populations, they're categorized as unassigned or broadly attributed to large regions. These ambiguous categories appear in almost everyone's results. We're told they reflect the limits of current technology, gaps that future research will fill. But what if they're not gaps? What if they're evidence of something the framework can't accommodate? What if the unassigned percentages point toward ancestry that the reference populations don't include because it's been deliberately excluded? The unassigned ancestry percentages are remarkably consistent. I've examined hundreds of genetic testing results from people of every recognized ethnic background: European, African, Asian, Indigenous American, Pacific Islander, people whose documented ancestry is as homogeneous as modern populations get. Almost everyone shows unassigned ancestry. The percentages vary, but the presence is nearly universal. Typically between 3 and 15% of genetic markers can't be attributed to recognized reference populations. The testing companies explain this as noise, statistical uncertainty, the inherent imprecision of genetic analysis. Nothing meaningful, just the limitations of the technology. But noise should be random. It should vary unpredictably. It shouldn't show consistent patterns across unrelated individuals. The unassigned ancestry shows patterns. Specific markers appear repeatedly in the unassigned category across different populations. Sequences that the algorithm can't place appear in people whose other ancestry is completely different. These aren't random, unattributable markers. They're consistent, unattributable markers. The same genetic signatures appearing in people worldwide, recognized by the algorithm as present but unclassifiable by the framework the algorithm was trained on. The testing companies have no category for Tartarian ancestry, so when they find it, they label it unassigned. The specific markers that appear in the unassigned category are revealing. Genetic testing examines several types of markers. Single nucleotide polymorphisms, SNPs, are the most common. These are single-letter variations in the genetic code that differ between populations. The unassigned ancestry includes SNPs that appear across populations that shouldn't share them. According to the standard model, these populations separated tens of thousands of years ago. Any shared markers should be ancient, present in the common ancestor before separation. But some of the unassigned markers aren't ancient. The mutation patterns suggest they arose relatively recently, within the last 1,000 years at most, possibly within the last few centuries. Recent markers shouldn't be shared globally. There hasn't been time for them to spread through normal population mixing. A mutation arising in Europe 500 years ago shouldn't appear in indigenous American populations that had no documented contact with Europe until colonization. Yet these markers appear, not at the frequencies you'd expect from colonial-era mixing, at frequencies that suggest much more extensive connection, as if the populations weren't actually separated when we're told they were separated. The mitochondrial DNA evidence is equally anomalous. Mitochondrial DNA passes from mother to child essentially unchanged, except for occasional mutations. By tracking these mutations, geneticists reconstruct maternal lineages extending back thousands of generations. The standard model sorts mitochondrial DNA into haplogroups. Each haplogroup traces to a specific ancestral woman living at a specific time and place. The haplogroups branch and spread, creating a tree of maternal lineages that supposedly reflects human migration patterns. But some mitochondrial sequences don't fit the haplogroups cleanly. They show combinations of markers that shouldn't appear together. Characteristics of one haplogroup mixed with characteristics of another, as if the neat branches had somehow crossed. The official explanation is convergent mutation, random chance producing similar changes in unrelated lineages. Statistical coincidence rather than actual connection. But convergent mutation should be rare. Finding it repeatedly in people from different populations suggests something other than coincidence. It suggests mixing that the standard model doesn't acknowledge. Sheol connection between lineages that were supposedly separate. The mitochondrial tree has branches we're not shown. Maternal lineages that connect populations in ways the official history can't explain. Evidence of recent common ancestry hidden in the data but excluded from the analysis. Y chromosome evidence tells a similar story. The Y chromosome passes from father to son, allowing reconstruction of paternal lineages parallel to the maternal lineages tracked through mitochondrial DNA. Like mitochondrial haplogroups, Y chromosome haplogroups are supposed to reflect ancient branching. Men today carry Y chromosomes descended from specific ancestral men living tens of thousands of years ago. The branches are supposed to be distinct, separating during ancient migrations and remaining separate until modern times. But some Y chromosome sequences show impossible combinations, markers from haplogroups that supposedly diverged before modern humans left Africa, appearing together in single individuals, paternal lineages that cross branches that shouldn't be crossable. The standard explanation again invokes statistical anomaly, unusual individuals, rare combinations that don't reflect broader patterns. But these combinations appear too frequently to be rare. They appear in people from different continents who have no documented common ancestry. They appear at rates that suggest systematic connection rather than occasional anomaly. The paternal lineages, like the maternal lineages, show evidence of recent mixing that the standard model can't accommodate, evidence of connection between populations that were supposedly isolated. The academic response to these anomalies has been consistent suppression. Research papers documenting unexpected genetic connections face unusual obstacles to publication. Findings that challenge the standard model are questioned more intensively than findings that confirm it. Scientists who pursue anomalous results find their funding reduced and their reputations questioned. I've spoken with geneticists who've noticed these patterns. Off the record, away from institutional oversight, they acknowledge that the data doesn't fit the model as cleanly as public presentations suggest. They describe pressure to interpret results within the accepted framework. They speak of careers damaged by asking wrong questions. The suppression isn't necessarily conscious conspiracy. The standard model is deeply embedded in the field. Challenging it requires challenging decades of accumulated research, institutional reputations, commercial interests invested in current testing frameworks. The resistance to anomalous findings follows naturally from the structure of the field itself, but conscious or not, the effect is suppression. Evidence that points toward recent global genetic connection is marginalized, explained away, buried in categories like unassigned ancestry that acknowledge the data while dismissing its significance. What would explain the patterns? The standard model assumes that human populations separated during ancient migrations and remained largely isolated until modern transportation enabled renewed mixing. Small amounts of gene flow occurred at boundaries, but major populations developed independently over tens of thousands of years. This model requires that shared genetic markers be either ancient, predating separation, or recent, reflecting documented contact. Markers that appear to be recent but appear in populations without documented contact are anomalies, statistical noise, errors in dating, anything except what they appear to be. But what if there was contact that isn't documented? What if populations mixed more recently than official history acknowledges? The Tartarian civilization, if it existed as the evidence suggests, spanned continents. It connected populations across distances that supposedly remained isolated. It would have facilitated genetic mixing on a global scale. And when that civilization collapsed, when its history was erased, the record of that mixing would be erased along with it. The genetic evidence would remain, but the historical context that explained it would be eliminated. This is exactly what we observe. Genetic evidence of recent global connection. Historical framework that denies such connection existed. Anomalies that the standard model can't explain because the standard model was built on the assumption that what explains them never happened. The Tartarian contribution to modern human genetics wasn't just mixture of existing populations. The evidence suggests something more significant, not just connection between populations that existed, but introduction of genetic material that hadn't existed before. Certain genetic variants appear in modern populations that show no clear ancestral source. They're not derived from any recognized ancient lineage. They appear relatively suddenly in the genetic record, as if introduced from outside the populations where they appear. The standard explanation is mutation, new variants arising randomly and spreading through populations. But the distribution of these variants doesn't match mutation spread patterns. They appear too uniformly across too wide a geographic range too quickly. The distribution matches what you'd expect from deliberate introduction, from a population that contributed genetic material globally, intentionally, and systematically. I'm not suggesting the Tartarians were non-human. The genetic evidence clearly shows human ancestry, human markers, human characteristics. Whatever the Tartarians were, they were human, but they may have been human in a way that we've lost. Human with capabilities we no longer possess. Human carrying genetic variants that encoded those capabilities. Variants that were diluted through mixing but not eliminated. Variants that persist in modern populations, usually latent, occasionally expressed. The capabilities potentially encoded in Tartarian genetic variants deserve examination. Modern genetics acknowledges that small genetic differences produce large capability differences. The genetic distance between humans and chimpanzees is approximately 1%, yet the capability difference is enormous. Within humans, variants affecting cognition, perception, and physical ability are well documented. What capabilities might Tartarian variants encode? The evidence from previous investigations suggests the Tartarians possessed unusual abilities. Perception of frequencies invisible to typical humans. Sensitivity to energies that modern science doesn't acknowledge. Capabilities that allowed them to build and operate technology based on principles we've forgotten. If these capabilities were genetically influenced, the genes encoding them would have entered the global population through Tartarian mixing. They would persist today, probably at low frequencies, probably usually unexpressed, but occasionally in individuals who inherited the right combination of variants, they might manifest. This could explain the persistent appearance of unusual human capabilities throughout history, people who perceive things others can't, individuals with inexplicable sensitivities, those whose abilities fall outside normal categories. These aren't supernatural phenomena, they're genetic inheritance. Tartarian capabilities encoded in DNA, diluted through generations of mixing, but occasionally appearing in combinations sufficient for expression. The deliberate dilution of Tartarian genetics explains patterns in post-reset population management. We've documented in previous investigations the movement and mixing of populations following the proposed reset. Orphan trains moving children across continents, mass migrations reshaping population distributions, institutional systems processing and relocating survivors. Viewed through a genetic lens, these movements serve to dilute concentrated Tartarian ancestry. Populations with high Tartarian genetic contribution were dispersed, mixed with populations carrying lower concentrations, distributed in ways that reduce the probability of Tartarian variants combining in future generations. The targeting wasn't explicit. No documents survive declaring intent to dilute Tartarian genetics, but the effect was systematic. Populations that might have maintained Tartarian characteristics through relative isolation were disrupted. Mixing was encouraged, sometimes enforced, ensuring that Tartarian variants would become increasingly rare. This is why the traits discussed in the previous investigation have become uncommon, not because they were inherently limited, but because they were deliberately diluted. The physical markers of Tartarian ancestry appear less frequently in each generation because the policies following the reset were designed to reduce their frequency. But genetic dilution can't eliminate genetic contribution. Variants don't disappear through mixing. They become less frequent. The probability that any individual carries them decreases. But across large populations, the variants persist. Modern global population is approaching 8 billion people. Even at very low frequencies, Tartarian variants exist in millions of individuals. Most carry too few to produce observable effects, but some, through chance combination, carry enough for expression. These individuals would show unusual capabilities without understanding their origin. They would perceive things others can't perceive without knowing why. They would have sensitivities and abilities that seem inexplicable, that set them apart, that make them wonder what's different about them. They're not supernatural. They're not chosen or special in any mystical sense. They're simply carrying more complete combinations of Tartarian genetic variants than most people. They're expressing ancestry that most people carry, but don't express. The implications for human potential are profound. If Tartarian capabilities were genetic, they weren't unique to Tartarians. They were human capabilities. Capabilities that humans can possess when the right genetic variants combine. Capabilities that our species developed but that have been diluted to the point of rarity. The Tartarian achievements documented throughout this series weren't alien accomplishments. They were human accomplishments. Things humans built, understood, created. Things we could do again if we recovered not just the knowledge but the genetic potential. This reframes the project of Tartarian recovery. It's not about discovering lost secrets from some other civilization. It's about recovering human capabilities that have been deliberately suppressed, not just suppressed through destroyed libraries and hidden knowledge, but suppressed through systematic genetic dilution. The technology, the medicine, the agriculture, the energy systems, these weren't beyond human capability. They were human capability that we've been manipulated into losing. Modern genetic research is approaching the ability to identify Tartarian variants. Genome-wide association studies identify genetic variants correlated with specific traits. If the traits associated with Tartarian ancestry could be precisely defined, the variants underlying them could potentially be identified. This would transform the investigation from historical reconstruction to scientific verification. The Tartarian genetic contribution could be mapped, the variants could be characterized, their distribution could be traced, the dilution process could be documented genetically, and most significantly, the capabilities could potentially be recovered. Gene therapy technologies allow insertion of genetic variants into living individuals. If Tartarian capability variants were identified, they could theoretically be restored, not through generations of selective breeding, but through direct genetic modification. This possibility explains why genetic research faces the suppression it does. The gatekeepers who benefit from human limitation understand the threat. If Tartarian capabilities could be genetically restored, their entire system of control would collapse. The suppression of genetic research into human potential isn't about ethics or safety. It's about maintaining limitation, about ensuring that Tartarian capabilities remain diluted, about preventing humans from recovering what was taken from them. The connection this creates between all modern humans is the deepest implication of Tartarian genetics. We're taught to see human diversity as separation, different races, different ethnicities, different populations with different histories and different genetic inheritances, categories that divide us, that make us see each other as fundamentally different. But Tartarian genetics cuts across every category. The contribution appears in every population. The variants exist in people of every recognized ancestry. The shared inheritance connects humans across all the divisions we've been taught to see. This shared ancestry isn't just ancient African origin, the common heritage acknowledged by the standard model. This is recent common heritage, ancestry from a civilization that connected all humans within the last few centuries. Genetic proof that human populations weren't as isolated as we're taught. The divisions aren't as old or as deep as we believe. The categories that separate us are constructs built on a framework that excludes our most recent common heritage. We're more connected than we're allowed to know. The Tartarian genetic legacy creates obligations as well as connections. If we carry the genetic inheritance of a civilization whose knowledge was destroyed, whose achievements were erased, whose very existence was suppressed, we inherit responsibility for recovery. The ancestors whose genes we carry were wronged. Their accomplishments were stolen. Their capabilities were deliberately diluted. We're not just passive carriers of interesting genetic variants. We're the surviving repository of human potential that powerful forces tried to eliminate. Every person carrying Tartarian genetics is evidence that the suppression failed, living proof that the dilution wasn't total. This reframes identity in significant ways. The ethnic and national categories through which we typically understand ourselves become secondary to a more fundamental identity. We're Tartarian descendants, carriers of a heritage that transcends the divisions we've been taught, connected to each other through ancestry that official history denies. The evidence of this connection appears not just in genetics, but in human behavior. Throughout history, certain humans have recognized connection across official divisions, have seen through the categories that separate, have understood at some level that the divisions weren't as real or as ancient as claimed. These individuals weren't simply morally superior, they were perceiving something real, the connection that Tartarian genetics creates, the shared heritage that the categories obscure. They were responding to evidence their genes carried even if their conscious minds didn't understand it. The impulse toward human unity isn't naive idealism, it's genetic memory, recognition of recent common ancestry pushing through generations of taught division. The Tartarian inheritance asserting itself against the frameworks designed to suppress it. Every movement toward human connection, every rejection of artificial division, Every recognition of shared humanity expresses the genetic truth we've been manipulated into forgetting. We are connected, recently connected. Connected through ancestry, the standard model excludes and official history denies. The recovery of Tartarian genetics parallels the recovery of Tartarian knowledge. As researchers identify the variants, as the genetic contribution is mapped, as the connection is documented beyond denial, the historical suppression becomes harder to maintain. Genetic evidence doesn't burn like libraries. It can't be demolished like buildings. It persists in living bodies, reproducing with each generation. The proof of Tartarian civilization may ultimately come not from architectural analysis or historical reconstruction, but from genetic mapping. The DNA itself may reveal what the suppressors worked so hard to hide. The bodies of 8 billion humans may constitute the evidence that can't be destroyed. This is perhaps why genetic research faces such complex regulation, why direct-to-consumer testing produces sanitized results that exclude troubling categories, why academic research into human genetic potential encounters such persistent obstacles. The genes contain the proof, and the proof threatens everything built on the lie that Tartaria never existed. What should you do with this knowledge? First, understand your own genetic testing results differently. The unassigned ancestry isn't meaningless noise. It may be the most significant part of your results, evidence of connection that the testing framework was designed to obscure. Second, recognize the capabilities you may carry, unusual perceptions, inexplicable sensitivities, abilities that don't fit standard categories. These may be Tartarian variants, expressing through your genetic combination, not disorders, not anomalies, inheritance. Third, look for the connection rather than the division. When you encounter people of apparently different backgrounds, remember that you share recent ancestry that transcends apparent differences. The divisions are shallower than you've been taught. Fourth, support research that challenges the standard model. The scientists investigating anomalous genetic findings are recovering suppressed truth. Their work faces obstacles precisely because it threatens the frameworks built on denial. Fifth, pass on what you carry. The genetic variants persist through reproduction. Whatever Tartarian inheritance you carry, your descendants will carry as well. The dilution continues, but so does the persistence. The genes survive. Tartarian DNA found in modern humans connects all of us, not through ancient migrations tens of thousands of years ago, through recent mixing within the last few centuries, through a civilization that spanned continents and contributed genetic material globally before its history was erased. The evidence is in the data, the unassigned ancestry, the impossible shared markers, the variants that don't fit the standard model. The evidence is in our bodies, the traits that cross ethnic boundaries, the capabilities that appear inexplicably, the connections we feel despite being taught division. The evidence is in our genes, carried in every cell, reproduced with every generation, waiting to be recognized for what it reveals. We are all connected, more recently and more thoroughly than we're taught. The Tartarian civilization didn't completely end. It persists in everyone descended from its survivors, which is to say, in everyone. The genetic legacy of Tartaria is human heritage, shared heritage, your heritage, written in DNA that science is only beginning to decode, but written nonetheless, waiting to be read, waiting to be understood, waiting to reconnect us with what we've been manipulated into forgetting, that we are one people, recently one, genetically one, Tartarian descendants, all of us, so connected through DNA that survives every attempt to suppress it, the proof that can't be burned, the evidence that can't be erased, the connection that can't be denied, not forever, not now that we're beginning to see. The Tartarian inheritance is waking up, in laboratories mapping unexpected variants, in individuals expressing unusual capabilities, in the growing recognition that the standard model hides more than it reveals. The DNA remembers what history was rewritten to forget, and DNA doesn't lie.